So this is the Gunbreaker tank. It's probably the funnest tank a lot of people are going to play, and it's also the most DPS-y depending on who you ask. Alright, listen, if you're watching this to become a top tier Gunbreaker, I would probably go somewhere else. This is more of a tailored lesson to some friends who want to start or get better at the class, and on PlayStation no less. But hey, if you play console or are an average or slightly above average player and want more down-to-earth videos and don't care that I have crappy 720p barely high-def footage, then I don't mind you sticking around. Forewarning, I explain a lot. It's very wordy. Now let's get to it before Endwalker comes out and makes half this video outdated and irrelevant. I'm going to break this into sections. Some things might get covered twice, but that's because they're worth repeating. But for now, let's just start with the tank's main job, pulls. Step 1, turn on the tank stance. Ours is called Royal Guard. Step 2, get the mobs. Now, there are a few ways for us to pull. The first and simplest way is to just run at the enemy ahead of your party and spam AoEs. This is the simplest and most common way, because you can do it in any level of dungeon. This one is also helpful because you'll likely be spamming AoEs anyway to grab all the enemies. The next way to pull is from a distance, using Lightning Shot, your tank's only ranged attack. Its use is to get enemies aggro to you quickly and start a pull fast. The drawback is that it only aggroes the one you hit for sure. The others could possibly target your soft, squishy, possibly rage-fueled healer. All tanks have a gap closer, and yours is called Rough Divide. You can do it twice at high levels, and this one is my personal go-to. It closes the gap straight to your targeted group, and since it's a cooldown, you get to spam your AoEs immediately after hitting your target. Since it has 2 charges, you can use it to pull multiple groups as well. It's a very fast and efficient way to pull, and this naturally segues me into my next section, what to do with your pulls. Now there are a lot of things you gotta think about when pulling. How far should I go and am I keeping aggro? Where am I standing? And now we also have to talk about your other tank job, bosses. Pulling bosses works the exact same way as mobs, so it wasn't worth mentioning, except it's even easier since it's just one enemy. But now this next part works a little bit different when doing bosses versus mobs or adds. Now how far should you pull? If your team is new, pull small. If your healer is at the very least experienced, go for bigger ones. Now these rules are not hard and fast. Mob pulls are really up to your comfort level, and it should really matter which dungeon it's in as well. There exists the tank excuse, pulled too hard, for a reason. You're gonna have to figure out dungeon by dungeon what's too much. Okay, well now that you've got this nice big juicy pull, what do you do with it? Keep aggro, and keep it away from your team. Keeping aggro is more important of the two. Without it, the enemies are just going to attack the nearest DPS doing damage to them, or they're going to bum rush the healer, which with enough salt scares me more than extremes and savages. So if you want to just play it safe, spam AoEs until there's only 1 or 2 enemies left, and if there's a bigger guy with more health around a bunch of smaller guys, then focus them. But remember to throw out AoEs every 1 or 2 of your normal combo rotation. But what happens if I lose aggro? Well, after silently berating yourself for being a fucking failure, I'm kidding. Mistakes happen, and sometimes there are simply too many mobs. So pay attention to the outskirts of the battle and to wherever you have your enemies listed on your HUD. Make sure all of them are red and targeting only you. If you see one turning yellow or go green altogether, then you've got to throw out some AoEs and re-aggro them, or if they've left the group, you gotta go get them. I use Lightning Shot more in these instances to maintain aggro on wandering enemies more than I use it to pull, but it's up to you. Situational context matters. One thing I won't recommend as often though is running up to get them, because it'll mess with your positionals. Another perfect segue! Now here we need to start talking about the bosses as well. Let's finish up the mobs first. You always want to make sure the bulk of your enemies are facing you and that your party are behind them. Many of them will throw out directional AoEs, and this way only you have to readjust for most of them. Also, contrary to popular belief, the tank can move. Don't absorb needless damage just to keep the pull stationary. As long as it's still facing in the same direction and you didn't run half a marathon, it's good. Do this and the melee DPS will love the easy positional changes, the ranged DPS and healers will love not having to stop attacks and move, and I will love you because you listen to me. Bosses are a little different. Some are a little easier, some are a little harder. For most of them, you want to face them away from the party like usual, but you also have to consider where you put the boss. Make sure you are not directly under the boss and are at the end of their little semicircle. Being too far under the boss might make them randomly change directions and lowering the melee DPS. In general, I try to make sure they are not in the center of the room either. That way, if they move away from me, the entire party recognizes that a big mechanic or an AoE is coming. Finally, tanking bosses requires you to see tank busters coming and 1. Get them out of harm's way of your party, and 2. Survive them. If you see a big red arrow in a circle around you, it's a nasty one that'll kill any DPS around you as well, so make sure you're isolated when it happens. For many bosses in dungeons though, they don't really have tank buster markers. You're gonna have to recognize the names of these attacks and eventually recognize when one's coming so you can mitigate it. I'll show you later how to make that easier. But wait, is it yet another perfect transition? It's almost like I scripted this. Yes, mitigation is probably the most important thing you can do as a tank to be the best tank you can be. So why did I wait this long to talk about it? I don't fucking know, shut up. It is at its most useful in mob pulls. Every tank has got both unique and shared ones. Use them often and use them in the right order, but also maybe think about how they work. Rampart is probably my most used one during mob pulls. It reduces damage 20% for a whopping 20 seconds, and its cooldown is 1.5 minutes. Maybe you pulled too big and are taking serious damage and you want to use Gunbreaker's Nebula. It reduces it by 30% for 15 seconds, but it has a whole 2-minute cooldown, and the seconds matter in this game. Regardless, using at least 1 mitigation cooldown per pull is a good idea. Don't do multiple unless it's a dire situation or you're dealing with a nasty tank buster. And keep in mind, all mitigations act a little differently. Heart of Stone is small and short, but it has a very quick cooldown and can even be put on teammates. Camouflage is very useful against mob pulls specifically because of its increased parry rate. Reprisal does an AoE against the enemy to lower their attack. It's useful both with mobs and with bosses. Even Arm's Length has its uses outside of the few knockback mechanics in the game. It'll slow down enemy attack speed if they hit you. I'll talk about some of the other tank abilities later, but right now I need to finish this long-winded section with these last 3 abilities.
Oh my god! Oh jeez, oh my god!
At this point, they're probably saying, Jesus Christ, I wasn't expecting this overly detailed video, what the hell did I get myself into? A similar sentiment shared by every healer who's ever had to deal with Super Bolide. This is Gunbreaker's specific invulnerability. It makes you invulnerable, but it also reduces your health to 1. Meaning if you pop it at the wrong time, now your healer is in a panic because in 8 seconds, you'll become mortal again with no health. It's very situational, and your specific invulnerability is the last line of defense. Thankfully, if you're smart, you'll pop this next ability right after it, Aurora. This is a special healing ability Gunbreaker has. It grants regen to yourself or any targeted party member. You should also be using it whenever you have a chance and your health is low. And finally, you have the last just straight up mitigation, Heart of Light. This one reduces magic damage for both you and all nearby party members. This is basically the big party-wide AoE mitigator. Keep in mind that lasers and energy attacks also count as magic damage in this game. This is useful in stack markers especially. Okay, now that we've discussed the basics of tanking and Gunbreaker's specific way of mitigating, now it's time to get into the nitty-gritty. The best way to play this job, for our skill level at least. Basic attack chain goes as follows. Keen Edge leads to Brutal Shell, leads to Solid Barrel. Don't do these out of order, or fuck you. If you do them in order, the second attack, Brutal Shell, will grant you a little health back, and after level 52, will also grant you a tiny barrier equal to that of the health you just recovered. And the final attack in the chain, Solid Barrel, will give you a cartridge. Gunbreaker's unique gauge in this game are the cartridges. They are required to use certain more powerful attacks. You can also get a cartridge by finishing the 2-attack AoE chain. You at the moment have 3 different cartridge attacks. Burst Strike, a single heavy attack, Faded Circle, a big AoE attack, and Gnashing Fang, which is actually 3 different attacks and has its own cooldown. Now Gnashing Fang works differently. It has 3 attacks that all combo in order. It goes Gnashing Fang to Savage Claw to Wicked Talon. and has a cooldown of 30 seconds because this one does the most single target damage overall. It still only uses one cartridge though. And what's more, at level 70, you get a special bonus attack called Continuation that can be put in between them as well and is made available upon their comboed ability's use. The 3 attacks that Continuation can become are Jugular Rip, Abdomen Tear, and Eye Gouge. Nasty, right? I love it. It's because of this crazy 6 attack chain that it has to have a cooldown, and it's also usually part of a Gunbreaker player's burst damage window. But what is your burst damage window? Well, take a look. Ooh, I almost forgot one thing, your other cooldown abilities. You get some attacks and abilities that are not tied to your normal attack recast timer. You can't use these as often obviously, but they can be sprinkled in between your normal attacks to keep the pressure up and the damage up. It's thanks to these that we have a nice big burst damage window as well. We have Sonic Break, which does damage over time to a single enemy. Bow Shock, which is a damage over time to a group of enemies. Interject will stop some enemies' attacks from happening along with their low blow stun ability. Bloodfest, which uses the target's ether to give you 2 cartridges for free. Danger/Blasting Zone, which is a free single target high damage attack. And No Mercy, which increases damage for 20 seconds. As for the others, here's my go-to burst damage window. Make sure you have 2 cartridges ready to go from your combos and not from Bloodfest. Then proc No Mercy to get the extra damage. Start with Sonic Break and Bow Shock for the damage over time. Then my Gnashing Fang super combo. Now go to Burst Strike, and then go and use Bloodfest to get 2 new cartridges for another 2 Burst Strikes and a Blasting Zone thrown in between them for good measure. After that, just go back to your combos and start building it up again. But these cooldown attacks can also be useful against mob pulls, not just bosses. For example, using Sonic Break against the beefiest enemy in a group is a good idea to start whittling them down. And using the cooldowns in between your other combo attacks can really reduce fight times. Well, I've talked way too much at this point, but now you have the gist of fighting as Gunbreaker. But we have some other things to talk about. For starters, recognizing attacks. Go into your settings and separate the attack bar and enlarge it and move it somewhere else. Go to HUD Layout, select Target Info in the UI element drop-down menu, and click the little gear next to it. There'll be a Display Info Independently button. I already have it pressed here. It'll separate it into Target Info, HP/Progress Bar, and such. I put mine above my hotbar and I made it bigger so I can better see the attacks coming and recognize when I can interject or stun them or if there's a tank buster coming. Other than that, I would also say zoom the camera all the way out to see the whole battle. Don't get ambushed by ads you didn't see. And speaking of ads, this is where main tanking versus off tanking comes in. If you're main tanking, do what you do against the bosses that I've already said and hopefully don't get into a provoke fight with another tank in raids. If you're off tanking though, turn your stance off and fight the bosses all the same. But you need to be ready to turn your stance back on or simply provoke if the main tank dies or if ads spawn, because you need to be able to help the DPS kill them and not have them harass the healers or the main tank who's already soaking up the boss's damage. Well, at this point I think I've covered everything except hotbar setup, so here's just some quick shots of mine. In general, I keep all of my basic and most powerful attacks on the right side of my hotbar because I'm right oriented and I hit the right trigger most naturally. I put AoEs on the left along with all the useful cartridges and cooldown attacks. On my second hotbar, I've grouped all my mitigation relevant abilities together since Gunbreaker has so many of them. Of course, it's not 100% well organized. This is just how I have it set up for me to use organically, but this is a good idea to follow. Keep the relevant abilities grouped together and not spread out or god forbid over different hotbars. Well, here we are really at the end now. This is everything I can think of. So now it's up to you to not fuck it up. Now go out there and be a perfectly adequate tank. I'm gonna go cry in a corner that Dark Knight didn't get cooler abilities, and I'm gonna end up playing Gunbreaker forever. See ya!